Hello everyone, FPL Raptor here and welcome back to another video on my YouTube channel. In today's video we have my Game Week 17 team selection. I just want to apologise for my absence here on YouTube. I've been very ill over the last 2 weeks. To be honest, I'm still very ill, but I couldn't let you down. I had to bring the content back before Game Week 17 so we can finalise our teams and hopefully get as many green arrows as possible going into 2023. There will indeed be a deadline stream on Boxing Day as well, so there's plenty of content to come. I will be able to help you with your teams and give you the best possible advice that I can. Without further ado, let's jump into today's video. So before we jump into looking at my current draft and the team that I'm looking at going into Game Week 17 with, I thought what would be useful is to look at the overall fixtures. Now, usually I would do this myself, even if I weren't creating videos for you guys. I would go into Excel, I'd create some sort of Excel spreadsheet, and I would color coordinate it based on if the teams have good long-term fixtures, good short-term fixtures, maybe a combination of both, or maybe they just don't have very good fixtures at all. The reason I find this useful is I think you want a really good combination when you've got a kind of wild card, whether that be at the start of the season or you're using one of your wild cards, or in this case, your unlimited transfers. I think it's incredibly useful to have some glue guys, and what I mean by glue guys are guys that you have decent long-term fixtures, play for a decent team, and you can keep in your team long-term. And also some really nice short-term punts. And what I think is if you don't have enough short-term punts, and you don't get slightly aggressive with some of your picks, I think you can sometimes just fall down the rankings really slowly, and you can never really... I don't think you can win FPL or do it especially well if you don't get a little bit aggressive with a few players and go a little bit shorter term. But equally, I don't think you want to go over the top with that. And I think sometimes you can be overly aggressive, pick too many short-term players and not have enough players with good long-term fixtures. So what I've done here is I've tried to sort of color coordinate that a little bit and just highlight to you some of the teams that I'm looking at for different reasons. So the teams that are highlighted in purple are teams that have, in my opinion anyway, good short-term and good long-term fixtures. With green, they might have some decent long-term fixtures, but mainly we're focusing on the short-term. Orange is good long-term, but maybe not the best short-term. You've got then yellow just have generally average fixtures, and I've put red poor fixtures. This is organised by a Fantasy Football Hub's fixture ticker. So at the top, the best teams, Chelsea, City, and then at the bottom, Bournemouth and Wolves have the worst fixtures according to Fantasy Football Hub. So as you can see here, there are a few teams in the purple that I think should fill out the majority of our squads for our unlimited transfers in Game Week 17. So Chelsea, City, Saints, Newcastle, Spurs and Brighton. These teams, in my opinion, have decent short-term and decent long-term fixtures. And as a result, if you pick these players, you can probably keep them for the next 6 to 10 weeks, which is, I think, as long as you really want to be looking. Yes, we might not play our second wildcard for another 15, 20 weeks, but it's more likely that we'll play in kind of, I reckon, 10 to 12 weeks. So that's the longest that I'm looking at the moment. But there are also some teams such as Fulham, Manchester United, and maybe Crystal Palace that over the next 2 or 3 have really nice fixtures. So I'm looking at trying to pick a few aggressive players maybe from those teams, whilst having a really nice basis of those from the likes of Chelsea, City, maybe Newcastle, maybe a bit of Spurs and Brighton too. And then you can see there are teams such as Arsenal, who, yes, Arsenal are a fantastic team, but the Fantasy Football Hub algorithm says that they don't have great fixtures over the next 6 weeks, and that's what this is organised by. And even after that, their fixtures just aren't that great. So I'm wondering is, yes, they're a great team, but do we need to be picking a lot of players from these teams? So this is something I will try and remember to post this, but feel free to take a screenshot. The reason I put this here is just so that you can start to think, I want to fill out my team with teams and players that have decent fixtures short and long term. I can take a few aggressive punts, and I don't really want to be starting to pick loads of players that don't have good fixtures now or maybe even in the future as well. So realistically, when you see Chelsea and Man City at the top of the list, we should probably have maybe 5 to 6 players from City and Chelsea. It's not always easy picking those players. And then when I'm seeing the likes of Arsenal down quite low there, maybe West Ham and Leeds quite down low, I'm not really looking at those players there. And then I may be eyeing up Fulham and Manchester United as 2 teams with some really good short-term fixtures. So that is how I'm starting to think about it. Without further ado, let's take a look at the actual draft. So moving on into the team, just thought I'd give you a quick update if you've not followed my journey this season, if this is the first video you've watched or maybe you've just forgotten. We've had an incredibly good start to the season. So at one point I was up at 149th in the world. At one point actually mid-game week I was 99th. So it was an incredibly strong start. Unfortunately, it was a huge red arrow in Game Week 16, and I'm now up to 2088th in the world. So it was a big red arrow, I should say, down, I guess, to 2088th. Still an incredibly strong start to the season. But just to confirm, I don't really change the way, and again, if you've watched my videos this season, you'll know this. I don't really change the way I play based on my rank. My reasoning behind that, and it's easier said than done, it is quite difficult when you do get up there, is that I should be picking the players that I think will score me the most points each week, and I should be trying to get the most total points. If I think a player will get me points, my rank and that player's ownership shouldn't really change. I think the only way that you should allow those around you to affect the decisions you're making is in two occasions. Number one, if you're interested in mini leagues, it makes a lot of sense to pick players that other people in your mini league don't own, or maybe you can even block them or cover them by picking players that they do own. I fully appreciate that. I think that's a good time to allow those around you to affect the decisions you make. And the second time is really late in the season, maybe game week 37. If I'm like 5th in the world, then of course, again, that's almost like a mini league then, and you can really start to make decisions based on that. Or maybe if you're like 15k and you really want to push towards the top 10k. Those are the only two times where I think you should really let those around you affect the decisions you make. Outside of that, I think you should pick players you think will score points, ignore ownership for the large part, and don't care if you've got a template team. So this might be a template team. To be honest, I've been too ill to be checking up on other people's teams and other people's content. So I don't really know if this is template. Some of these players feel like such no-brainers, a lot of them, that I think this will be a fairly template team. But I have picked a few players that I think maybe won't be as popular as others. I've maybe missed out a few players that I think a lot of other managers will own. With all of that being said, I'm currently lining up in a 3-4-3. My team value is about 103 to 104 million. Depends some of the players that I sell. If I sell them, I've got a lot of money tied up, so my value might drop slightly. And this team that I've built currently has 0.9 million in the bank. Now, I've not left that there for a particular reason, although there are 2 or 3 positions where maybe I'm to and fro between 2 different players, and one of them is a little bit more expensive. And maybe if I change a few of those 50-50s, I'll probably end up using the full 0.9 million. So at the moment, I've got some money in the bank to play with, and I've got some flexibility. Let me know down below in the comments when we move on to any of these players, if you think any of them are maybe not great picks, if I've maybe missed any news. Like I said, I've been very ill. So if one of these players is maybe slightly injured or something and I've not realised that, then please do let me know down below. And then, like I said, there will be a deadline stream on Boxing Day where we can go through this team in more detail and finalise all of those picks. So, in goal and in defence, I've actually got, and I didn't think I would have this, a Chelsea double up. Now, this is a similar sort of situation to when I picked Pope and Trippier. I tried explaining that sometimes you don't want to look at it as a double up. Sometimes you need to look at each of the players by themselves in isolation and think, are they a good pick? And for me, both Kepa and James, for different reasons, are fantastic picks. For me, I'm not looking at this as I'm having a double up on the Chelsea defence. Kepa is 4.5 million, incredibly cheap. And Chelsea, as we saw, have in the top 2 best fixtures. They've got double game week coming up. They look really, really good for the fixtures. And I do expect Potter to tighten up that Chelsea defence. We started to see a couple of signs of it. And I'm not saying they were a great defence before the World Cup, but we started to see a couple of signs. And I just think that they will start to improve as they get more games under Potter. So I think at 4.5 million, to get a keeper from a top 6 team, from a top 6 defence, arguably a top 4 defence when they are playing well, and with the fixtures coming up, I think that Kepa does look like a decent keeper. Now, I would say that I think there's definitely justification to just go for Ward and Everson. I think Ward and Everson are cheap. Leicester's fixtures are, I put them as an average team, so they've got decent fixtures. And Leicester were a team that were defending incredibly well before the World Cup. They've got a couple of injuries now, and I'm not sure that they will keep clean sheets at the rate that they did pre-World Cup, but they still could definitely be good value. So I think if you're struggling for money, or you just don't trust the Chelsea defence, I think you can absolutely go for Everson and Kepa rather than Ward and Kepa, which is the combination that I've got. But I really like Kepa. And then James is a really tricky one for me because with basically every team's got 3 or 4 with cup competitions as well, games in really, really short succession coming up. And I don't expect players that are injury prone or maybe have a lack of match fitness to play all of those games. And Reece James is one of those players. I do not expect him to play all of the games that Chelsea have got coming up. But when he does play, he's arguably the best defender in the game. I would say he is the best defender in the game alongside Trippier. I think he's better than Trent. And I think I thought this in previous seasons. When you look at value, Reece James has never been as expensive as Trent, and he's just got such attacking threat. And he can just pull an 18-pointer out of nowhere. The issue we've got with James is he also loves to pull a 0 and 1-pointer out of nowhere. And when James doesn't start games, he often comes off the bench. So I think James is a very frustrating player to own. I'm not necessarily sure that I will be going with him. I guess my thought process at the moment is it's easier to go with James. And if we realise actually James just isn't match fit, he's not going to play a lot of games, he's like rotating, playing every other game, then you just downgrade him to someone like a Diogo Dalot or a Ben White or someone like a Sven Botman. There are so many good 4.5 to £5 million defenders that you could go for instead. I think it's a lot easier to start with James, who's more expensive, and then downgrade than going with like a Ben White, who realistically, Ben White, even if he ticks along, is probably not going to massively outscore Reece James. And then thinking, actually, Reece James is playing every game. He's looking really good. Loads of people are getting his points. Now I need to move for Reece James. So at the moment, I'm thinking it's easier to do it the other way than to do it to start without James. So at the moment, he stays in my team. But I do understand that And I do appreciate if your thought process is he's not going to start all of these games, he's probably not. It's definitely worth having a strong first sub coming on. And if you're in a three defender formation, making sure that you've got a strong defensive sub to bring on, whether that be like a Patterson, a Bueno, or a Ben White or Diogo Dalot. There are loads of good cheaper options that you can have. Sven Botman, like I said, these are some of the ones that I really like. Just make sure that you've got that person to come on. The only issue is, of course, if Reece James comes on for a 1 point, then you won't get the defender anyway. And then the other two defenders are also two defenders who have good attacking threat. We'll start with Cancelo, because really Cancelo hasn't been great from an attacking perspective this year. He's got a couple of attacking returns, but his underlying data has actually been really poor. He's sitting at about a 0.12 expected goal involvement this season, which is nowhere near as good as we've seen in previous seasons. And as said at the start of the season, he almost drops into the pivot alongside Rodri quite a lot of the time. And then even when Gundogan plays in through the middle, he often just drops in and sits in a more central, deep role than he has in previous seasons. The thing is with Cancelo, he still takes a lot of shots, and he does still get to the byline occasionally, and he's an absolute bonus point monster anytime he does get any kind of attacking return. And even if he doesn't, he is kind of prone to picking up a 9-pointer. So I still think Cancelo's a great pick. I don't think he's necessarily worth all of that money. My issue is I want to be able to get into the Man City defence. I don't really like Ederson because he just doesn't make enough saves, therefore he doesn't get enough bonus points. Walker's just not quite nailed enough for me, and he's got absolutely no attacking threat, and he's really, really terrible for bonus points. I don't mind a Kanji, especially if Diaz is injured, but is he 100% nailed? Am I going to miss the clean sheet when they get it? Potentially. And then I don't mind Laporte, but Laporte's starting to get to an expensive range now where I'm like, well, I might just pay the little bit extra for Cancelo. So I'm almost paying more for the nailedness of Cancelo as opposed to the attacking threat. I just think he's a very safe player to pick. And when I look at the rest of my team, I don't necessarily need the funds. If I went from Cancelo to Walker or Cancelo to Akanji, I'm not necessarily sure I would need the money elsewhere. So if I don't need the money now, in a similar situation to James, is it not better to just start with Cancelo? And if Cancelo doesn't look like great value, and maybe Akanji is playing every game, then you can make the switch. So for that reason, I've started with James and Cancelo, because it's easier to start with them and downgrade than it is to start without them and then try and find the money to move towards them. And then the third and final defender is Kieran Trippier. This is a fairly no-brainer. Newcastle have been fantastic. Trippier has been the best defender in the game. His attacking threat is great. Newcastle kept another clean sheet in the EFL Cup against Bournemouth. I think Trippier is absolutely fantastic. And to be honest, if you told me you were going with Pope, I don't mind that. I had the Pope and Trippier double up for like 6 or 7 weeks before the World Cup. I also think Botman, like I said, is a really good cheap defender if you want to go for Trippier and Botman. I do not have any issue with you picking Newcastle players. And to be honest, I think 2 or 3 Newcastle players makes a lot of sense post-World Cup, and I expect them to continue to their great run of form. So that's the defence. Fairly standard, fairly straightforward. As a result of such a strong back three, my two bench defenders are both fairly cheap. I've seen a lot of people with a backline similar to this, and then they're going for Diogo Dalot and Ben White. It just feels like if you've got 3 strong defenders like James, Trippier, Cancelo, are you ever realistically going to bench them? Probably not. Even when they are benched themselves, they'll probably come off the bench. I don't feel like you need to go for 3 strong defenders plus 2 really strong defenders on the bench as well. Even though the likes of White and Dalot are fairly cheap, I think you can go even cheaper for the likes of Patterson and Bueno. Botman, like I said, I've got Castagna on the bench, who I bought at a much cheaper price too. I think I bought him at 4.4. So I would probably go fairly cheap on the bench with your defenders if you've got a really strong defensive starting lineup. So that's the defence. Let's move on to the midfield. Right, I spent far too long talking about defenders there, so I'm going to be a little bit more succinct here. Starting in midfield, I'm actually really, really happy with my midfield. However, I think the midfield is the most difficult position to be picking for the unlimited transfers team. The defence pretty much picked itself, bar a couple of players, and the strike force, there are 4 or 5 that I really want, but I think, again, there are fairly straightforward decisions to be had. The likes of Haaland, I think, are just no-brainers, and there are some other no-brainer picks in the attack as well. The midfield, I think there are arguably maybe 10 to 12 really good midfielders that I'd like to pick. But assuming that you have someone like an Andreas on the bench, who I do think is just such good value to have as your 5th midfielder, you can only pick 4. And I think that is really, really tricky. So let's start with the premium midfielder. I think Salah and De Bruyne are both great picks. I think Salah and De Bruyne and Haaland is fine as well. I just ended up having to make too many sacrifices for my liking. It meant I couldn't have a mid-price midfielder. It meant I had to take away one of my premium defenders. And I also had to take away, on some occasions, one of my slightly better attackers. And I just felt like I was making too many sacrifices to shoehorn De Bruyne in, especially when I think Foden, on his day, assuming he starts to play more games than he was pre-World Cup, I think on his day he can match and outscore De Bruyne. Now, I don't think over a longer period I would fancy making that bet that Foden would outscore De Bruyne, but I don't think personally, at the moment, De Bruyne is worth the extra 4 million that's required. And then, like I said, you end up having to make at least 2, potentially 3 or 4 downgrades just to get him in. And when I'm never going to captain De Bruyne, I'm never going to captain De Bruyne. If I think a City player is the best captaincy option, I will captain Haaland. On the few occasions where I don't think City have a great fixture, or maybe I don't know that Haaland's going to start, well, then I'll just captain Salah or captain Darwin or Foden, or there'll be some other options that I've got. Most of the time, I'm never going to captain De Bruyne. So for that reason, I just don't think he's worth the premium price tag. So my second and only premium, I've only got 2 premiums in this draft, is going to be Salah, and I'm pretty set on that. The only way I would get De Bruyne is probably as a third premium, but I just don't fancy it for the reasons that I've listed. I think that Salah and De Bruyne are a 50-50 bet. If you're never going to captain Salah either, I think it's a lot closer, but for me, I could, on a couple of occasions, see myself captaining Salah. Yes, pre-World Cup, he wasn't great. Yes, he hasn't been great for a while now. But in a similar situation to what I said with Cancelo and James, I don't really need the money. Like, if I went from Salah to someone else, I don't really need it. And I don't necessarily back De Bruyne to outscore Salah massively. Now, I am recording this before, obviously, Liverpool and City play against each other. If City smash Liverpool and De Bruyne looks great and Salah looks really quiet again, maybe I'll do a bit of a knee-jerk transfer and bring De Bruyne in for Salah. But for now, I'm back in Salah, I'm back in Liverpool, and I expect them to do relatively well post-World Cup. I think we'll start to see the Liverpool of old start to emerge. I've also got Foden in there, like I said, to almost cover the City attack a little bit. They've got the double game weeks coming up, 2 of them. And I just think that Foden's just, on his day, he's fantastic. And before that little spell where, for some reason, Pep just randomly dropped him before the World Cup, he'd started pretty much I think he'd started every single game in the Premier League up until like game week 13, game week 14. Most games in the Cups as well. He was basically a starter in Pep's lineup, even above and beyond De Bruyne. So I guess I'm kind of hoping that he starts to be a regular starter in the team again for Manchester City. I guess that Foden spot could be pretty much anyone. There's talks like Kulusevski. I've seen a few people maybe talking about. Maddison could be another decent option. Or I could even go all the way down. I think Anthony could be decent as well. But as we'll see, I've maybe got enough Manchester United players in my team at the moment, I think. So there are a few decent picks in there. Maybe Martinelli, Saka, although Arsenal's fixtures just aren't great. There are lots of options. So I guess for now, that is probably one of the main positions in my team, which I could definitely see changing, that Foden spot. I've got Foden in there because I think I want to try and get as many City players in my team as possible. It seems crazy with the way they've been playing and the fixtures they've got to not have 3 Manchester City players. For now, Foden's in. If I do somehow make a switch from Salah to De Bruyne, then of course Foden could become someone else. Let me know down below what you think of Foden and who you've got in that sort of mid-price midfield slot, if you've got that price point in your team. And then I've got the 2 cheaper boys, but arguably the 2 easiest picks in my midfield. We'll start with Rashford. Little bit disappointed in the World Cup that he didn't get a little bit more game time, because when he did, he was absolutely fantastic. And I do think Rashford's starting to find his old form that we've seen. He's absolutely lethal in front of goal. When he's in form, when he's confident, in a similar way to Almiron, he's absolutely lethal. And I just think with the 3 fixtures that United have, is it Forest, Wolves, Bournemouth? I think are the 3 fixtures that we have post-World Cup. I think they're 3 really good fixtures. And then you can just switch him to the likes of a Martinelli, or if anyone else cheap pops up, one of the Brighton midfielders. There are a lot of options in and around that price, and there are always cheap options that pop up that maybe we're not expecting to do that well. And I just think that Rashford is, at the moment, one of the best picks, just due to the fixtures that Manchester United have. And also, Manchester United looked pretty good pre-World Cup. It was actually one of the teams that probably weren't very happy that the World Cup kind of broke up that momentum a little bit. So Rashford for now in my team. I am a Manchester United fan, so any opportunity to get Manchester United players into my team, I'm going to take that opportunity. And then the fourth and final midfielder in the starting 11 is Almiron. This is a tricky one for me because eye test-wise, Almiron has been great, but the data would suggest that he's been very, very, very lucky to score the amount of goals he has, and that maybe we would expect to see him regress back to his underlying data and maybe see a downturn in his returns. The reason he's in my team is he's so cheap. Newcastle have been absolutely fantastic, and he is passing the eye test. And even in the friendly that they've just had, Newcastle, and in the EFL Cup, he still looked absolutely brilliant. He just isn't necessarily putting up the underlying data to suggest that he's going to continue that. But sometimes the underlying data doesn't pick up everything. And I think at that price point, when I've picked to the rest of my team, I've not got a ton of money for that final spot. And I just don't see any other standout midfielders. Maybe I just bite the bullet and just say, do you know what? On this occasion, the underlying data isn't capturing the full story here. That being said, I've got 0.9 in the bank, so I can have Martinelli in that spot. I've not yet made the transfer, so I've still got that money tied up in Martinelli. Maybe I just say, do you know what? The fixtures aren't great for Arsenal, but maybe Martinelli is going to still score goals. And you'd still expect Arsenal to score goals. Not at the rate that they did earlier on in the season, but I would still expect them to do well. Yes, Jesus is injured. Yes, the fixtures aren't great, but maybe I just keep Martinelli in that spot there. Let me know down below, what are you currently thinking about Almiron and Martinelli. Have you got either/both in your team? If you could only pick one, if you're in my position with this current team, and you can only pick Almiron or Martinelli, who would you have as that fourth and final midfielder? But that is the midfield four. Andreas Pereira is the fifth midfielder. I have had a little bit of a think about using all 5 midfield slots or maybe going for a 3-5-2. I just think there are some really, really good striking options, and I like a lot of the forwards. And I think it's easier to start with Andreas as the 5th mid and to have 3 strikers. I just think that's a slightly more fluid formation and a better way to set up our team, thinking a little bit longer term as well. So that's the midfield. Let's move on to the forwards and the bench too. So moving on to the forwards and the bench too. I'm not going to insult your intelligence by talking about Haaland for too long. He's absolutely fantastic. Didn't go to the World Cup. Looking very fit. Fingers crossed he gets through the EFL Cup game without getting injured. He's a permanent captain in most of our teams. I don't think there'll be anyone out there that's realistically suggesting going out without Haaland. So Haaland is my second premium. Salah and Haaland, neither went to the World Cup. I think both will have a point to prove coming into the new year. I think they are arguably, in my opinion, the best 2 premiums to pick. I don't mind Kane. I don't mind De Bruyne. I don't mind Bruno Fernandes as like a half premium. I think there are some other really good picks. But for me, these 2 just make a lot of sense. And I've got a bit of a soft spot for Salah, as I always have. As an FPL manager that's been playing for a few years now, I think most of us have a bit of a soft spot for Salah. We know what he can do. And Haaland has just been absolutely ridiculous. So those are the 2 premiums. I've got Darwin in there as well. The reason for Darwin is obviously Diaz and Jota are both injured, looking like they have long-term injuries as well. He's got to start most games for Liverpool. They just don't have enough options to bench him regularly. So whilst I don't necessarily expect him to start every single game for Liverpool, I think he's going to start kind of 95% plus, and that's enough for me. And we've spoken about earlier on in the season, his data has been better than Salah's. He's been pushing Haaland. He's just not necessarily been taking all of those chances. But we have seen glimpses of great finishing. He's been a great finisher in the past as well. I would expect him to... Basically, what we're going to see, I think we're going to see a slight downturn in the likes of Almiron's actual output in accordance to his underlying data. If Darwin can continue to put up similar underlying data, we're just going to have to see an increase in his performance. I don't think he can continue to underperform his underlying data like he has been. And I'll expect Darwin and Liverpool to start scoring quite a few goals. So Darwin and Salah, I think, could be a really nice double up. The fixtures aren't fantastic for Liverpool, but I still think they're 2 really, really nice options. And the great thing about Darwin is there are loads of options cheaper than him. You've got the likes of Mitrovic, who I've not got in here. You've got Adams. Southampton have really, really good fixtures. There are a few cheaper options. You could go for a Solanke from Bournemouth if you want to go all the way down. There are tons of options. So I think Darwin's at a really nice price point where if you do want to downgrade, you'll then be left with money in the bank. So you could almost do like Darwin down to a cheaper option and then upgrade Almiron if you want to, if those 2 players don't work out. So I think you've got the options there. I think Darwin's just a really, really nice pick. And I just think he's got such a high ceiling. He's so explosive. And he's got that in him to get 3-4 attacking returns in a single game. So maybe the slightly surprising pick in the starting 11 and in this team. And I'm not necessarily saying that I don't expect anyone to go with him. Again, I've not really been watching FPL content. I've been too ill. But I think Martial is maybe the one that people will be slightly surprised by. That's not just because I'm a Manchester United fan. It's, again, looking at the fixtures over the next 3 for Manchester United, looking at players that I think have a really high ceiling, I think Martial is one of those players. I think if he wins a penalty, or if for some reason Bruno Fernandes isn't on the pitch, Martial has taken quite a few penalties recently. Now, granted, they've mainly been when Bruno's not been in the pitch, or if Martial's won the penalty, but I still think he's a player that's happy stepping up, taking a penalty. And when Martial plays, he gets goals. The issue with him has always been his fitness and staying fit. I'm recording this before the Manchester United game in the EFL Cup against Burnley. If he picks up an injury, I'll probably have to re-record this. Assuming he gets through that fine, and assuming he plays some minutes, I just think, obviously, Ronaldo's left now. Martial's pretty much our only number 9. I feel like we're perfectly happy playing. Yes, Rashford can play through the middle, apologies. Yes, we can play Elanga through the middle and Garnacho off the left. There are some options, but realistically, it's going to have to be Martial. So, whilst I don't expect him to play every minute, I expect him to start the majority of games. And if he can string together a few starts without getting injured, I think Martial is one of the best strikers in the game to own in FPL. The other reason for not having Kane and Mitrovic is, as you can see here, these are players with 4 yellow cards. Now, the 4 yellow cards threshold moves once the team that they play for has played 19 games in the Premier League. The threshold then moves from 5 to 10 yellow cards and then moves from 1 game ban to a 2-game ban. So once Arsenal have played 19, Jesus, but he's injured anyway, their threshold will move. Once Fulham have played 19, then Mitrovic's threshold will move. And once Spurs have played 19 games, the threshold will move for Kane. I'm just thinking, yes, Mitrovic is a great pick. Yes, they've got the double game week coming up. And as we saw with the fixtures, Fulham have some really good fixtures. I just wonder, can I take a slight risk going for Martial instead of going for Mitrovic? Hope Mitrovic picks up the booking. Those people that pick Mitrovic will obviously miss him for that game. and hope that Martial can either match or outscore Mitrovic. I don't know if it's a risk that's worth taking, but again, I'm trying to not focus on ownership. And if I don't focus on ownership, and if I imagine that no one's going to own either, I quite like the idea of just taking a little bit of a cheeky punt on Martial. So that is the current thought process. I'm picking Martial ahead of Mitrovic. Now, there is a very good chance that I just go for Mitrovic in that spot and just pick the safer option, and let's just hope that Mitrovic doesn't pick up a booking. I just think that the rest of my team, I think it will be, again, I don't know. I've not really been looking at other people's content. I assume this is a fairly standard, fairly template team. I've got most of the bases covered. And again, I'm not really bothered by ownership particularly. I think Martial could definitely outscore Mitrovic over the next 3 to 4 weeks. And if it doesn't work out, I've got a bit of money in the bank. I can just do Martial to Mitrovic for their double game week if I really don't think this worked out very well and I don't want to keep Martial anymore. Or if Martial picks up an injury, or maybe let's say Mitrovic gets booked in the first game. Maybe I keep Martial for the first 2 and then move to Mitrovic. I mean, I've got some options here. I'm not stuck with Martial. They're at a very similar price point. I think Martial is 0.1 million less. At the moment, I like Martial ahead of Mitrovic. Let me know down below if the 4 bookings is putting you off at all with Mitrovic. Let me know if you're definitely having him in just due to the decent fixtures, great underlying data, and also the double game week as well. Just finally with the bench, I've actually got Ward rather than Everson. Ignore the picture. That is Danny Ward in there rather than Everson. Like I said, I did have Everson and Ward. I just think it's worth the slight upgrade in money, especially when I've got that money in the bank to go for Kepa instead of Everson. So Ward and Kepa are my combination of goalkeepers. I've got Andreas as my first sub. He's an absolute baller. And if Mitrovic does get suspended, we know that Andreas will now be on penalties in his absence. So let's say that is for the double game week. We'd have Andreas in a double game week with one of the fixtures, him having penalties. So I think he's a fantastic option. And I think he's a bit of a no-brainer. Makes a lot of sense to have him as your 5th midfielder. I've kept Castagna for now. I'm definitely tempted by Ben White. I'm less tempted by Diogo Dalot or Luke Shaw. The reason for that is it looks like Martinez and Varane will miss at least the first fixture, potentially the second one for Martinez. I think there's just going to be a little bit of disruption with Manchester United. And I don't need the defender that I have on the bench for the next few weeks. I've got James Trippier, Cancelo. What I need is a defender who I'm happy to own long term. And in the longer term, maybe I'll need to start bringing them into my team. So I don't think a Manchester United defender makes sense for that reason, because I don't need a player with good short-term fixtures. And yes, Ben White is fine, but again, he feels like the sort of player that might tick along with a few clean sheets, but he's not got a great attacking threat. Do I think Castagna could outscore Ben White? Absolutely, and I bought him at a much cheaper price. So I think a lot of people won't necessarily want to go for Castagna now. Like I said, I think I picked him up at 4.4 million. So for me, Castagna feels like a really good option to keep. So for now, Castagna is my 4th defender. And then my 5th defender is Patterson. I do really like the look of Bueno from Wolves. The issue is I think Johnny and Nate Nuri are coming back from injury soon. And yes, Bueno could keep his place. But I feel like Patterson is just a little bit more nailed on for only £0.1 million more. And just in case I do want to play the bench boost at some point, Patterson, if he has a double game week, feels like a decent bench boost option. So those are the 15 players. Apologies for this video being a bit choppy. I've had to keep pausing and cutting the video because I keep having a coughing attack. But hopefully that makes sense. Hopefully I've not made any major mistakes in my delirious state. And hopefully there's decent justification for all of the players that I've picked. If I'm looking at players that I could see myself changing before the deadline, and again, I will discuss this on the deadline stream, I think Martial versus Mitrovic feels like a spot where I've not fully decided on that. I think the Foden spot is definitely one where that's open for debate. There are loads of really nice options around that price and a little bit cheaper too. And then probably Almiron. If I downgrade Foden or if I have a little bit of money, maybe I upgrade Almiron. Maybe I go for a Martin. And if I can kind of get to a Saka or someone around that price, maybe I do that. Or maybe someone like an Anthony if I don't go for Martial. So probably Foden, Almiron, and Martial. Those are the 3 spots where I'm still a little bit up in the air. I think Kepa, James, Trippier, Cancelo, Salah, Rashford, Darwin, and Haaland. I think those players are fairly straightforward. Maybe the bench will change slightly, but I don't think that matters too much. Let me know what you think of the team. Let me know down below in the comments what your team is currently looking like. Let me know what your dilemmas currently are. And yeah, feel free to give my team a rating out of 10. So guys, there you have it. That is my Game Week 17 team selection. If you have enjoyed today's video and you appreciate me being here despite feeling absolutely terrible, please do drop a like on the video. Make sure to subscribe and also drop a comment down below to feed the algorithm gods. The YouTube algorithm is not going to like me because it's been so long since I've uploaded. So please do drop a comment and drop a like to help boost me in the algorithm a little bit. Make sure to tune in Boxing Day. I think it's 9 a.m. 2 hours before the deadline on Boxing Day. Make sure to tune in for the deadline stream as well. We'll be doing a normal deadline stream. Luckily, the place that I'm actually recording these videos at home has decent internet, so it means I can actually do a deadline stream. So set your notifications. I'll see you on Boxing Day morning. Until next time, thank you very much for watching. Cheers. Bye-bye.